when Jesus heard this. When Jesus heard about the execution of John the Baptist, the brutal murder by the state with the indulgence of arrogant, entitled Salome thrown in, the death of John the Baptizer, the one who had baptized Jesus. We read it just a few weeks ago as we're going through the narrative. John was a very close friend of Jesus. According to Luke, his cousin, they were kindred spirits, allies in the struggle to be faithful to God under the oppressive thumb of Rome. Now John has been brutally killed and dismembered. "Bring me the head of John the Baptizer on a platter," she famously said, and it was done. When Jesus heard this, he was surely grief-stricken, likely angry, probably discouraged, maybe despairing. It's the death of a friend, but it's also all the empirical power that event represents. Score another point for the Roman Empire against the chosen people. This is the setting of Matthew's telling of the story we know so well, the feeding of the multitude, one of the few stories found in all four Gospels, a very important story in the Jesus movement and for the early church, and an important story for us. When Jesus heard this, he withdrew to a deserted place by himself. I'll bet he did. Surely he needed to reflect, to grieve, to pray, to rest. Tempers would be understandably hot. John's death is the sort of violent, bigoted, politically charged act that leads to crowds in the streets, angry demonstrations, cries for justice, finger-pointing and accusations of fake news in all directions. Things can get out of hand. Jesus needed to get away. He went by boat. But when the crowds heard it, they pursued him on foot. When they heard what? That John was dead, or that Jesus was gone, or both, whatever it was drove them to that deserted place, the wilderness, following Jesus, so that by the time he arrived at his destination, he was met by a great crowd. No mention of what the reaction might have been, no mention of the loss of the personal time and space Jesus was seeking. No, when he saw them, he had compassion and cured all their sick. Compassion turns out to be the magic word in the story. It all hinges on compassion, feeling with, connecting in a deep way to what the other is feeling. Compassion, it's the opposite of sympathy. It's the ultimate of stepping into another's shoes. And so, because of compassion, it turns out to be a good day. Jesus demonstrates that compassion is what it's all about, even when one is feeling depleted by anger and disillusionment and grief. Even when one had planned for peace and quiet and solitude and instead was met by overwhelming need. It turns out to be a good day as people are cured and healed and given hope. And that might be enough of a lesson right there, don't you think? Even in sadness, even in anger, even in discouragement or despair, to seek to be compassionate, to feel with, to take action from a place of compassion no matter what. And so, at the end of the day, it's time to go home. Let's wrap it up, the disciples advise. Get people on their way back so they can return to town and buy some food before everything is closed. No, says Jesus, you give them something to eat. We know this story. We know what Jesus is going to do. We know what Jesus can do. After all, he's been curing people all afternoon. The title of the story in your Bible usually reads, Jesus feeds the 5,000. Why does he say, you give them something to eat? It seems to be an important question. Why does he tell them? Why does he tell us? You do it. You give them something to eat. And I don't know about you, but I might respond somehow like the disciples did. Me? I got nothing. That's what they say. We got nothing. Nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. You've probably heard that the loaves are more like little buns or rolls, which is why Jerusha's lunch bag is so illustrative. The amount of food described in this story is a typical peasant's lunch for one. So it isn't literally nothing, but it might as well be. Why don't you feed them? Jesus asks, because we got nothing. And of course, Matthew will make a point of telling us that the crowd numbered about 5,000 men besides women and children. You do the math. Was that 10,000 people? 15? 2 parents plus 2.5 kids per household? It was a lot of people. Out in the middle of nowhere, in a deserted place, in the wilderness, with all the biblical overtones that carries, you give them something to eat. We got nothing. I don't know about you, but anymore that's how I feel. In the face of the world's need and injustice and the troubled times we live in, I got nothing. What I have to offer, what I can give, what I can do over against the need, the injustice, in the face of the powers that be that are beyond my control, it seems like less than a drop in the bucket. I got nothing. Nothing more than a happy meal in the face of 10,000 hungry people and a political system that doesn't care. I can help the food bank pack weekend food bags for hungry school children, or I can donate some money to help pay the delinquent lunch accounts of my neighborhood school, but the need is overwhelming and the system is broken. I got nothing. I can write a letter or make a phone call about hate crimes legislation or assault weapons, but nobody's really listening, not to people like me. I feel so small. I got nothing. And I live in a democracy and enjoy religious freedom. This was the Roman Empire, the mighty Roman Empire. Imagine how those who had just witnessed the murder of John the Baptist felt. We got nothing. The deck is beyond stacked, Jesus. We got a little faith and a little lunch, and you're awesome, Jesus, but what difference does it make? People need to head back to town and do the best they can. So Jesus shows them what to do. He takes the food, he tells the people to sit down, he blesses the food and gives it to the disciples to give to the crowd. An interesting detail, he's showing them, he's empowering them. The disciples are the ones who actually feed the people and make sure there's enough and take up 12 baskets of leftovers. It's about compassion, he seems to say, not despair or cynicism or powerlessness or whatever it is that takes over when we're overwhelmed by the world's injustice and need. It's about offering what you have, he seems to say, not focusing on what you don't have. And it seems to be a perspective that comes perhaps more easily in a deserted place, in the wilderness. A perspective that may be harder to take in the day-to-day world of ordinary life. Jesus is reminding them of the ancient lessons of the wilderness, where God fed the people what they needed, reminding them of the motivation of compassion and calling them back to themselves. And a lot of people get fed. As you know, we will try in vain to explain the mechanics of this. We do know, says Professor Stanley Saunders, that in a deserted place, in a wilderness place, at dusk, in that moment between dark and light, quote, "The economic and social realities of the Roman Empire and the Galilee do not hold." In this location set apart, even though his private time was taken from him, Jesus offers the perspective that he himself was seeking, the God perspective, the compassion perspective, the ability to step away from the overwhelming realities of the culture to look and to act with the eyes and in the name of the one who has fed people in the wilderness from the earliest moments of faith. Again, Professor Saunders, in this story, divine power is set in contrast with the corrupt, violent, and fear-inducing power of Herod Antipas, who just murdered John. And as they and we are reminded of this divine power, the same divine power that brought God's people through 40 years in the wilderness, Jesus shows them and us what can be done with perspective, compassion, and lunch money. And that would be enough of a lesson, I think. But the story continues, these two stories linked together from the wilderness to the water. Jesus sends the disciples ahead in the boat, dismisses the crowd, and finally has the chance he's been seeking to go up the mountain to pray. And all night, we're told, the disciples' boat is battered by waves, the wind against them, far from land, all that literally and metaphorically means. And early in the morning, Jesus walks toward them across the troubled water, and they're terrified. "Take heart," says Jesus. "It is I. Do not be afraid. It is I. It's me." And we don't want to miss that the very words translated "it is I" are the same words translated "I am" when Moses asked for the divine identity. I am. It's me. I am. Deliberate double entendre, intentional multi-level reference. It's me, your pal Jesus, and I am. Tell Pharaoh that I am commands you to let my people go. In other words, in case you didn't get it yet, what's happening here is a God thing. The same God who fed you in the wilderness, the same God who parted the sea to bring you from slavery to freedom. This is the real deal. I am is your pal Jesus. Something truly awesome, the way we used to use that word, awesome, is happening. How thousands of people eat, how somebody walks on the water is not really the point. The point is an opportunity to remember who we are and whose we are. Enough about nothing. We are people of the one who feeds people in the wilderness. Enough about fear and ghosts. I am. The lesson closes with a little Peter comedy. You know his name means rock, and he sinks like a stone because he's afraid and because he takes his eyes off Jesus. The lesson at the end of the day is that we got to do it. The work is ours to do. Jesus doesn't provide the food or feed the people. It's our work to do. But we don't do it on our own. And we won't do it trying to fight Herod on his own terms. No, it will be about staying connected to I am, to the one who creates and liberates and comes to us in Jesus. Truly you are the Son of God is the conclusion of the shaken but newly inspired disciples. Finally they get it. They see. They are in the presence of the one true God, the God of the creation and the Exodus, the God of the wilderness and the promised land, the God who reminds us that despite all evidence to the contrary, it's the empire that's got nothing. Whether it's the Roman Empire represented by Herod or the powers that be in our own day, they get it. And it's time to go home, back to town. We know that the disciples professing the true identity of Jesus will soon forget, and so will we. hoping that somehow Jesus will take care of things and that we will be absolved, we will slide back into our we got nothing discouragement. But like manna in the wilderness, this iconic story, rich in its reference to God's power and authority, are food enough for the day. Amen.